on something or other. Wiretap.
Test, test. There you go. Hello everyone, welcome. This panel is going to be on government and surveillance, and what an incredible week to have a panel on this topic. I know that all of us on stage and many of you in the audience will be reeling with the revelations that we've had that seem to be kind of constantly happening, and it seems that there's going to be more to come. I just want to start by introducing myself and the panelists, and then we'll begin. So my name's Eric King, I'm the moderator today. I work at Privacy International. We're an organization based in London where we work on surveillance issues, among many other things. We have Gharbeia here from the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, Alana Sita from OpenITP, Simone Halink from Bits of Freedom, and the wonderful Moez from the Tunisian Internet Agency. And I think that the perspectives that we're going to be talking about here and learning about here are going to offer a really interesting take on the news this week, and also looking at what's going to be coming up. So to begin, some of the things we've learned, or I shouldn't say learned, because these are things that many of us suspected for a very, very long time. This is almost a confirmation, or at least an element of it, and it's kind of been broadly talked about as being PRISM, but I think it's really important that we understand that PRISM is a code name. It is a code word for a program authorized under Section 1881A of FISA in the US, and it allows spying on people anywhere in the world on the basis of their political affiliation, with very few additional safeguards. And so I wanted to open that up as the first question to everyone here. As non-US citizens, for the most part, how do we feel about that, given that we have a fundamental right to privacy, and the US is claiming that they are able to lawfully spy on us with very few justifications? And Moez, I was wondering if you could start that off.
Okay, hello. It's really complicated to start with this question, really, because what we need to mention first in this panel, I think it's about what is the situation in terms of human rights. When we deal with the surveillance, we need to focus on privacy and human rights, and what is the situation in a country like Tunisia. We know very well that we were in a period of time before the revolution where everything was under surveillance. We have a mass surveillance equipment, and it was used for different reasons, and mainly political, but of course there is a lot of security reasons to do surveillance. But what is important now after the revolution is to mention if Tunisia there is a commitment to protect privacy. You know very well that we have a convention in the Council of Europe, for example, and there is really, I'm really wondering that why Tunisia, for example, after the revolution didn't go through the process to approve this convention. If you want to get a reform on surveillance or on cyber criminality, on cyber crimes, and to legitimate some surveillance equipment for users, that means that at the same time you need to also have safeguards, and those safeguards, I think, we need some maybe treaties, and the Convention of the Council of Europe could be one of the instruments used. It's not efficient, I know, but at least there is something from the government side that could be really protective for the surveillance. Yeah.
So, I mean, is that the question here? Are we discussing whether political surveillance is appropriate? Is that lawful?
I mean, I guess in part it depends on intent, and I just kind of want to jump back into Tunisia for a minute. I mean, yes, it would be great if they'd signed treaties and they'd expressed an intent to change, but they also didn't deinstall any of the surveillance gear. I mean, all of that equipment is still there in the same place, right?
Yeah. The equipments are available in ITI data centers, still there, but what we are raising now, the issue is just to say that ITI is an internet exchange point, it's building an internet exchange point data center, it's an IP transit service provider, but we don't need to deal with surveillance. It's not our role at all. It's never been written in any text, in any regulation, in any law that ITI need to do that. So why we are doing that? So if you are hosting those equipments, that means that it is for historic, how to say, because we had during the regime of Ben Ali, a lot of will to have those equipments. What we did is that after the revolution we say, okay, we don't need to have censorship, so censorship stopped, but at the same time we need to be very careful with the surveillance because there are a lot of orders still coming to the ITI saying how to help the court to deal with some issues related to cybercrime or something, but we don't have any regulation on that. So ITI dealt with this very carefully. We tried to be efficient, we tried to have some positive response to the court, but at the same time we tried to convince the government to deal with the reform because we are not accepting that the surveillance equipment could be hosted in our data centers. This is something not linked to our work. We are dealing with connectivity, we are providing an internet exchange point, so it's services, IP transit services, but we don't need to host the surveillance equipment.
But Moez, are you just saying there that surveillance is still ongoing, but you're just saying it's not on your desk anymore?
No, we're still using them, but the orders are just coming from the court. And we take a lot of attention until now and waiting because we don't have a reform actually. We're waiting for this reform. We're waiting for the government to take really good decisions on these reforms and to deal with the security in a good manner while protecting human rights. But my concern is we need both reforms. We need to strengthen the privacy regulation. We need to strengthen the role of the privacy authority. We need to reinforce the role of the community to understand what is the threats behind the surveillance. But at the same time, we need to deal with day for day, with the court orders and all those happening in Tunisia. We need to deal with this very carefully. So this is my concern.
If I may step in here, actually. Regionally, I think it's good to distinguish between two modes of control, and any state will require some mode of control, I assume. And I'd like to dub them the Egyptian mode and the old Tunisian mode. And the old Tunisian mode, just like you have also in Syria, in UAE, the state would target the content by censoring it, and obviously this is not existent now in the new Tunisia as we are seeing. But this is also only one way of doing it. The other way, the Egyptian way, which has been going on since the internet started, is that there has been very little censorship taking place, but instead the state is not targeting the content, rather targeting the people behind the content. And that would require more surveillance, and I think it would be safe to assume that if you are not doing with one, then you have to do with the other, just to maintain rule of law. So my question now perhaps is, particularly with the lack of the legal framework for you, with what you've been saying, Moez, does that mean that the Tunisian state is moving from mode 1 to mode 2?
I think that's true, but at the same time we need to focus on this kind of reforms. My concern is about this reform is because we didn't work a lot during this period to ameliorate the regulation in terms of privacy. So if you are dealing with this kind of reform, we're saying, okay, we have to legitimize some surveillance according to the court orders, that's okay. I think this is the step what Tunisia now is doing, actually. They want to have an independent body that deals with those orders very carefully, but that could be also at the same time, and my concern is about how to audit this body, how to audit these institutions later on, because we accept that those orders can be implemented today, because of some situations, but we need to, at the same time, to build a global model, including the justice reform and privacy reform, and of course, the cybersecurity and cybercriminality reforms.
I think this is one of the problems that we're having globally right now, and impartially just, in these weeks as we try to figure out how to react to the revelations that we've seen, is that we don't have a political model which is coherent for the world that we live in. The problem is that if you have the technical capability to comply with a warrantless, or to comply with a wiretap with a warrant order, that used to mean that somebody had to walk out to, a phone central office and like plug something in and, start a tape recorder, and it was quite expensive.
Yeah.
But the way the systems are built now, and not even the way the wiretap systems are built now, but the way we deal with data now, if you can perform a single wiretap with a warrant, you can also just take everything. And what does oversight mean? I mean, if you accept that the content, that the specific targets need to remain secret for reasons of national security, for reasons of ongoing investigations, if you accept those as reasons, there is no way to audit it. There's no way to prove anything.
I think so as part of Privacy International's work, we often look at intelligence oversight models around the world, and for a long time, frustratingly, we were actually pointing to the US as a better model. They're one of the few countries in the world that has a court. Now, that has failed spectacularly, we've seen, in its actual ability to perform effective oversight. And I think, the revelations that we've seen and how Congress and the Senate and the public have reacted have shown just how out of step, any kind of oversight model, could possibly be in place. But there's an additional kind of oversight that can happen, which is within the technical standards. So a number of the surveillance boxes that are used in many countries around the world are built to specific standards. In Europe, we have the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, and that requires that certain pieces of technology have certain capabilities. So for example, if you're a telecommunications box, you must be able to intercept 5% of all traffic routing through it. Now, what's interesting about those standards is that there's no ceiling limit, right? It's all minimum standards going up, and so everyone gets their stamp, but there are no controls saying, actually, if you go above this, what you're now providing is illegitimate. And I think it's a failure of states broadly to actually define what are the limits, what are the things that we're not okay with. And I was just wondering, again, kind of looking at the Egyptian example and also the Tunisian example here, regardless of the, what the question is what kind of oversight can be put in place? There's a huge amount of technology that is still in Tunisia, that's still being used, and it doesn't work immediately in a different way to provide lawful interception or targeted interception. It starts off with being mass, right? My understanding is that was the case. Perhaps that's something you can respond to.
No. What we have is that, for sure, the equipment that have been provided for a long time have been with a lot of functionalities that we don't need really after the revolution, because we dealt with some special cases and very simple cases with asking for example, to identify some IP addresses or something like this. So we use the equipment differently, for sure, and it's not a matter of traffic. It's not a matter of having all the traffic monitored. What we need now is just to try to help the court to answer some questions about identification of people, for example, in special cases related to national security or the terrorism or something like this. Of course we tried, because it's not efficient anymore as before, because we didn't invest on those equipments, we didn't do anything, and the government also are aware of this. So we try, at least we try, but we use them not in the same manner. It is actually just used when we had an order about only one address, or one page, for example, one Facebook page or something like this. We use this equipment just to identify people behind that pages, if it is threatening, for sure, the national security or something like this. We try to help. We try to use the equipment in a different way as it was used before. We try to have a lot of concerns on privacy. We don't have any regulation on that. We don't have any constraints. But we try with the best will to help the court to solve some cases. That's it. But it is the minimal surveillance that is used actually in Tunisia, and we are ready to prove anything. So if there is any audit for the ITI during those 2 years, we are ready to any audit in this time. But what I need to mention is when we deal with surveillance and when we deal with the government role for surveillance, it is for sure the role of the government to protect security. We all accept this, but most important thing with the government is just when we deal with surveillance, we need to educate people working on those surveillance equipments. We need to explain right principles, how they need to deal with the human rights, how they can protect the privacy of people, how they would need to be aware of those issues. And then, of course, if there is any issue that is related to national security, related to our, the role of the government is also to do that. But at the same time, they need to deal that a different way.
Yeah, I think that the things that we're discussing here to a large extent, very much depend on the amount of trust that we have, or the value of that. So countries can tell us what kind of surveillance they use. They can have checks and balances, but as long as we have no facts to check that with, then I think it's actually quite valueless. And I think that is exactly what PRISM sort of exemplifies. What we see is that we are distrusting our governments already for a very long time, and now we have the proof that is actually the case, and it's sort of getting worse because other governments are also saying that they're doing the same things. For example, the Dutch government has admitted that it's also using PRISM, and so it's no longer just a violation from the US towards Europeans or citizens all around the world, but it's also abuse of the Dutch government according to the same standard. And so what I'm very interested in this discussion is how, assuming that we have laws and assuming that they could be abided and assuming that we have checks and balances that could work, if they were in some sort of sense transparent, how are we going to make sure that transparency is actually there?
I think part of this has to start with being transparent about capabilities. Public laws and public interpretations of laws in public courts are definitely necessary, but we also have to know what can actually be done, because we can't make a judgment on the basis of what might be being abused if we don't understand what's being abused. So I think, to bring this back to the local case, one of the best ways, one of the things which is in fact critical to start that conversation about what the restrictions should be, what the capabilities should be, Moez, would be to have transparency around what the capabilities are right now. What are the existing and not currently deployed, or mostly not currently deployed, but still existent censorship machines in Tunisia? What are the capabilities of the surveillance rooms in Tunisia? Transparency there will go a long way to starting the policy discussion.
Transparency is a process. We need to work on this. We are really willing to be much more transparent as we are trying to provide a lot of information about what happened before, but it's not easy. It's not easy for different issues, because being transparent at the same time and without building a new alternatives to respond to the court orders, for example, or to help the justice and to ensure national security is an issue. If you try to destroy all what Ben Ali did today, what will be the situation of the national security in Tunisia? We have experienced it, actually, after 2 years. We have a lot of examples. It's not a matter of the internet, but it's with physical security, it's with national security. I think we need to be transparent, for sure. I want the government one day say, this is what happened exactly for the internet during the Ben Ali regime, this is the equipment that have been used, this is the capabilities, and whether the vendors that helped us or not for this period, it's okay, we are okay with the vendors. The most important thing is that they need to accept that they provided this for a reason, but now things changing. They need to be, it's like a transitional justice for us. We need to deal with this differently, because what is our concern today is to build a new trust relation with the government, with the vendors, and with the society. And what is important also to mention that we won't go backwards to what happened before. It is for sure important to mention the name of the equipments, as Sami and Gharbeia many times asked me to do. As it is very important to mention, to answer the questions what Nawat raised many times for the ITI. It's for sure important for us to publish everything regarding that. But I think we need to deal this step by step.
Perhaps, sorry, could you just give a little bit of background You talked about vendor relationships, and I was just wondering whether or not, just for the purpose of the room, you could explain what you mean by that, and what that role is, and just kind of talk about that for a moment.
Vendors, they are using the technology to answer the question of the government. The problem is not in the vendor themselves. The problem is in the government that asking those functionalities to do it against their people. I agree that maybe they are considering that weapons and so on, there are a lot of regulation on that on the European Union, but you need to understand that the most important thing today is to have commitments from the government that are ruling us today, that they are considering the principles of human rights before any other issues.
I would actually find it very interesting if organizations themselves would sort of take that position because the government is not doing it. And to draw on a parallel, give an example, we have the Amsterdam Internet Exchange, and last week there were questions asked by a member of parliament, and apparently there's large preparations going on by the government to create equipment for a massive interception of internet traffic in the Netherlands. And so this would most likely be enabled by the Amsterdam Internet Exchange. What was very interesting in this discussion is that they have a very big role in being transparent about this, because the government is clearly being secretive about this, and the Amsterdam Internet Exchange is a membership, so that made this extra interesting, because all the members, which are, of course, ISPs and all kinds of other organizations, really pressed the Amsterdam Internet Exchange to sort of explain what was going on and to make sure that the whole process was entirely transparent, and to make sure that their interests were best protected. So I actually think that organizations have a very important role in sort of clarifying what kind of surveillance equipment are used and to make sure that they are not abused by government.
That's true.
I think this goes further in that the companies that actually produce the equipment have a responsibility to deal with the effects of what they're producing on the world. I mean, one of the issues that comes up is you get things like NDAs and contracts where it's like, well, okay, you know, if you have a large carrier class switch vendor that your country has a long-term relationship with that also sold you some surveillance gear and you suddenly change your mind, you know, that company has a right to, has a responsibility to say, oh, you know, we understand that governments do get to change their mind about civil liberties, and we have a responsibility to allow that government to, you know, to reflect the will, you know, to reflect popular will, and not be in a position where the vendors of surveillance companies and the vendors of, you know, carrier-grade IT equipment are in and of themselves directly responsible for the continuance of regimes of surveillance. Like, that's deeply, deeply problematic. You know, in a similar way, vendors of carrier-grade equipment have a responsibility to be honest about the capabilities of their equipment. Last year at the Stockholm Internet Forum, the, I think, Senior Vice President for Corporate Responsibility at Ericsson stood up on stage and in response to direct questions from Syrian activists said, you know, we only sell standard GSM equipment, by which, you know, was intended GSM switches with, you know, full intercept capability, because that's standard GSM equipment, refused to admit that there was wiretap capability in these machines, and said that they were proud to be supporting the Assad regime. You know, it's not acceptable to do this.
So if there's an ask to the governments here as part of the Freedom Online Coalition, what is it in relation to that point?
I think there's a fairly short policy statement. It's, you know, public courts, public laws, public interpretations, public oversight, equal rights or equal treatment under law for all humans, not, you know, regardless of national identity, rights to access and encryption and ephemerality.
So one of the points that we heard a little bit earlier on was whether revealing capability will damage national security. It was a point that the US have been very strong on recently, saying that these leaks have damaged national security. And I thought it would be interesting just to explore that point for a moment and maybe begin to get some feedback from the audience on whether or not we think that's legitimate. I think there's been an interesting trend in this regard. I mean, 50, 60 years ago, it was thought that revealing the existence of intelligence services at all would be damaging in and of themselves. And then we kind of got over that and we said, oh, actually everyone knows that they're already doing it, so we can talk about this openly. And then we put our intelligence agencies on a statutory footing. Then again, it was thought, well, we can't possibly reveal who's in charge of the agencies, because that again would endanger national security. And about 20 years ago, or less in some other states, we said, well, actually, no, this would be okay to highlight who's in charge and who's responsible for this. Is this a trend that we're seeing, that some of these arguments that are touted saying that everything, revealing any kind of information relating to surveillance endangers national security? Or is that an argument that is slowly being kind of eroded and no longer is legitimate?
I think it is slowly being eroded on technical grounds, but I also think there's only so much that it is right to do in the name of national security. It doesn't justify destroying society. You know, national security is about the security of the population and the well-being of the population. And if your surveillance tools and your surveillance regime is undermining the well-being of the population, you are no longer promoting national security, even if you are promoting the security of the state as opposed to the security of the people. I don't think that it is acceptable to not publicly acknowledge all of your security capabilities, because you are undermining the foundation of civil society, and the result is not a safer and healthier society.
Is there anyone in the audience, just very quickly, from government who would like to disagree with that point? I feel that we should air it before we pass it on to Moez to see whether he'd like to say anything on it. Yeah?
Microphone.
Good morning. My name is David Martineau, and I'm the French special representative, and I'm ready to take the heat.
Very good of you.
I've been thinking about that a lot, because we know the rules. We have public rules when it comes to warrants, when it comes to judicial inquiries, investigations. All that is fair and clear and transparent. The thing is, in a previous life, I've been working with the security, the French intelligence services. I was not part of them, but I know more or less how they work, notably on counterterrorism. And the thing is, massive surveillance may not be efficient. I don't know really. What I can say is that my government is definitely not willing to invest the amount of money and time that would be necessary to be able to process the data from Google plus Twitter plus Amazon plus all the others. We're not willing to do that. Too much money, too much energy, not enough efficient, I guess, when it comes to our priorities. But what I know is that when it comes to counterterrorism, it's always a mix of sources, in human sources, technical sources. And I'm sorry, because I know I'm talking in front of an Egyptian friend and a Tunisian friend who have been enduring an oppressive state for too long. And I know that it is very painful for you to hear that, but we still consider ourselves as a democratic state, and we have enemies. And I definitely don't agree with your distinction between enemies of the state and enemies of the people. When a bomb explodes in the street of Paris, there is no state involved, there is no, I mean, we're talking about human beings. So, and that's the purpose of the state, of a democratic state. It is, the first liberty is to protect the security of its citizens and non-citizens, by the way, who happen to be in the streets of Paris or any other capital. So my point is, yes, in principle, you are absolutely right. We would like to live in a world where we can genuinely show our cards. But the thing is, those groups, and I mean, I've been mentioning terrorist groups and terrorist activity, but I could also talk about pedopornography and those kind of criminal networks. Their tool is to adapt themselves all the time and to hide. So if we show our cards before, and I say if we, I'm not part of them anymore, I'm just a diplomat talking in international conferences. If we show our tools, if we show our capabilities, then we're prepared to lose the battle.
Can I shortly respond to this? So I live in a country which I think is very, very similar to France. And I don't trust my government in the way that you trust your government, because I don't know what's going on. And over the last couple of years, what I've seen is that the Dutch government is giving itself more and more powers that I don't know what they're doing or what they think they have, what they're doing, and actually they don't know it themselves. And I think that, as sort of basic understanding of what a government is doing, is the minimal amount of trust that we should have to give them at least a little bit of room to, in fact, do the important work that you say they should be doing. But it doesn't mean that those basic boundaries cannot be set. And to give an example, what we're talking about is that the Dutch government is introducing these proposals like a hacking proposal, where the rules are just not defined, so we're giving them unlimited power. The same would be for the unlimited interception of internet traffic. And the other thing that they've introduced is a sort of network detection network. And if you ask them what it means, they don't know. So I don't think that this is a basic starting point for discussion about surveillance.
I'd like to respond.
Please, and then let's hear from Fika as well, and then across to Jake.
With all respect, I think that you fundamentally misunderstand the role of the state. The role of the state is not to ensure the security of the people who are resident in that state. It is to ensure their well-being. Those are very much not the same thing. The well-being of the people requires that they have privacy in their communications and in their effects. Unlimited surveillance powers, regardless of what they stop, undermine the basic foundation of civil society. It doesn't matter what you are stopping, there are conditions under which it is not worth to carry on. It is an acceptable cost for some terrorist attacks to succeed. It is an acceptable cost for there to be some crime. States must accept that. Populations must accept that. Populations do accept that because people understand that freedom is more important, and freedom means some risk. And if you do not allow people to understand the context in which they live, and that means understanding the kinds of surveillance that they are under, they are not free, and all of your protection means nothing.
If we just hear from Fika first, and then we can come back. If there's a specific point, sure.
Well, I'm very happy to absolutely and fully disagree with you on that. I think if you lose a wife or a husband or a son or a father in a bombing, well, your well-being is a bit mined. Well, that's my take. And what I can tell you is that in the French society, and maybe in others, but I would only speak about the French society, you will never find a consensus on your point. The French society agrees, maybe we could organize polls, that they need to be protected, first of all.
I think the state has an onus to prove that if you believe that if the well-being of people is better served by unrestricted surveillance and unrestricted government power in the name of preventing some mythical all-consuming terrorism, then you need to show evidence that that is actually true and that that will actually result in a better well-being for the people, because the states around the world that are engaging in surveillance without limit have shown have in no way shown that this is actually going to result in a better outcome. If you can demonstrate this in an open forum with open evidence, then we can talk about whether you should get unlimited surveillance power. But if you're not even willing to demonstrate to the people why they should submit to a regime of unlimited surveillance, then I don't think you really can justify it.
Okay, let's hear from Fika.
I wanted to follow up on the point that Simone also made, because I think this draconian law that is coming and that our national security agencies and our Ministry of Safety and Justice in the Dutch society is grabbing every straw they can to surveil us even more. There's no checks and balances before or afterwards. So even in our normal communication law or a tapping law, they at least have to report to Congress. And in this law, there's no transparency behind it. They don't have to report on when, on what, on why, on how. They can just do it. And when you ask them about it, they say national security. And I think as long as we can't have an open discussion about it, it will be just pointless.
Can I make right?
Oh, sure.
For sure, it's a good debate that we have to hear today. And I think that this issue means what Sami said before this panel. He said that today in Tunisia, we don't deal with censorship, but we deal with surveillance challenges. And I think this kind of debate shows a great will of the Tunisian government, of the society and the private sector to share ideas, very important ideas. When do we need to survey people? Do we need to do it, or do we need to not do it? For censorship, it's clear. We don't need to censor anything. Because we have an example. We had a great example in Tunisia. When we censor, we raise access to those content. We raise more and more and more access to those contents. Example for pornography, for any content in internet. But besides that, do we need to encounter some surveillance or not? But this is the question, I think.
But this back and forth that we're seeing, Moez, is exactly the reason why we shouldn't be investing in the French path. We don't want to gradually and increasingly in a process build our transparency on the hope that one day we'll end up with good governance that you have in the United States that we have now, with the NSA completely having total surveillance not only on its citizens but on everybody. So this is exactly why people in your position and countries that are going through revolutions like ours should create a different path, and that different path should aim at using technology to push back the intelligence services by using strong cryptography, by using anonymizers, by using privacy and increasingly decentralized infrastructure, so that at one point the NSA is pushed back to its original role of intercepting some communication and then working on cracking the code. And even that should be contested by a democratic process.
And to add, you said transparency is a process. I actually think it's an act, and it's an act of individuals and companies who have the information available that actually give that information. So it's either companies that publicize transparency reports, or it's people like Edward Snowden that actually give up part of their own freedom to make this information public, and that's very important.
Can I just react on the transparency thing?
Sure.
Because I said it's a process because of the situation we have in Tunisia. I know it's an act for your country because you are very well educated, we are prepared for transparency, we are very prepared maybe for open governance, but in Tunisia it's a process actually. We don't have any constitution, we don't have laws, we're still using the previous laws, and we need to deal with this carefully because otherwise the state could be ruined.
And there's the gentleman in the front.
Well, coming from Sweden, it's a rather ridiculous standpoint that you should be very clear on having freedom from surveillance, but then saying that the state should take care of the well-being of the people. This kind of positive freedom, unlimited positive freedom, is of course one of the highways to the totalitarian society. So I think that we have had a number of discussions in European and Western history of ideas on this matter between positive and negative freedom. I can understand that there is a great problem of legitimacy with regard to surveillance. It's obvious so, and it's also inherited in the fact that if surveillance is going to be effective, it can't be entirely transparent. The way to deal with this is, of course, to have checks and balances, to have oversight by democratically elected assemblies, and see that you construct a constitutional framework that creates the necessary legitimacy with regard to the people. Obviously, the Dutch government has something to do in order to create a system which is legitimate in your views. We have had a very heated debate in Sweden about our surveillance legislation. We had to go back to the parliament twice before it was accepted. That kind of discussion, I think, is natural, it's very important, it is very good. But stating that the state has not a responsibility for the security of its people, that's even more libertarian than the Night Watch state, because even the Night Watch state sees this as one of the basic state fundamental functions, to secure people from other people infringing on their human rights, because that it ultimately is about.
So what I did not say was that the state does not have any responsibility for security. What I said is that they have a responsibility for well-being. Security is a subset of well-being, but security is only one aspect of well-being, and the other aspects of well-being are being steamrolled in an explosion of surveillance. You know, Sweden, you know, had a public debate on what surveillance was allowed. The position that Sweden settled on was that non-Swedes weren't human, that the rights of non-Swedes and the right of non-Swedish internet users whose traffic transits Sweden to be surveilled could be, you know, calmly waved out of the picture. Sweden has total capture of all non-Swedish traffic that transits its borders. How does this justify equality under law? You know, this is not looking after the well-being of the people in anything but an incredibly narrow definition. And I don't think I've ever heard as Orwellian a statement as saying that too much freedom leads to totalitarianism.
I think that's, if I may, I think there's...
Foremost, you misunderstand the Swedish legislation. The Swedish legislation is such that it must be taken into court, and it must be a court procedure in order to have such a decision. That's one thing. The second is that I did not say that too much freedom leads to totalitarianism. What I said was that the way that you interpret positive freedom, that the state is ultimately responsible for the well-being of its people, is much more is much more risky than the concept of negative freedom. And we have had the discussion in Europe for decades and even for centuries. And I think that your way of interpreting, saying that the state's primary responsibility is to take care of the well-being of the people, that is actually exactly what the totalitarian regime said in Eastern Europe and Central Europe 20 years ago.
I was responding to a statement that the state is responsible for the security of its people, and noting that if you're going to take a positivist approach to start with and say that security is a state responsibility, then you are taking a too limited approach and you need to look at well-being instead. I'm not advocating a positivist approach.
Ellen, if we hear from Jake on this point as well.
I'm not sure. All right, here we go. So I had just a sort of opening question for these two guys, because I feel like there's an important clarification, which is, have you ever heard of a gentleman by the name of Sir William Blackstone? This is for the French intelligence agent and the Swedish, whatever, guy? Just a yes or no is very easy. William Blackstone, so better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. You've heard of this, it's Blackstone, Blackstone's formulation. Have you heard of this before? No, I'm not surprised. Swedish guy?
Can I speak? Yes, I've heard of him.
Okay.
That's
all I'm
no. That is only demagogy. I fully agree with this basic judicial principle. It's not a question of catching everyone, but it's a question of preserving the basic security in society for the citizens.
Okay, so
what we are talking about is actually criminal acts that kills people.
That's right.
And if you're talking about for those people, it's digital. If they are killed, they are killed. Final.
Yeah.
If you're only talking about catching some people, why are you surveilling all people?
We are not surveilling all people. We have
all traffic that crosses Swedish borders from outside of Sweden is captured. That is surveilling all Swedish people.
That is not true. We have very, very targeted programs.
Okay, so I actually, the reason I asked that question is because I sort of expected that the intelligence agent wouldn't know and the Swedish guy would know. And I'm glad to see that, and I actually think very highly of both of these people in that it's clear that they're good and moral people, and they want to stop these things from happening, and I respect that. So what I would say is that it's important to recognize that these people do have good intentions, but they don't recognize some of the side effects. So I had the opportunity to ask Carl Bildt about the FRA law, and much to my surprise, he explained that it's legitimate for foreign intelligence purposes. And I understand that. So it's also legitimate for my government to spy on you for foreign intelligence purposes. And your parliament gets no say in it. It seems to me that that's sort of an interesting thing that cuts both ways. And when you have the ability to trade that information, what right do any citizens actually have in the end? It seems to me the thing we have to recognize also is the history. And Sweden, I'm sorry to say, and France, I'm sorry to say, should have learned this lesson. And it seems to me that you have not learned this lesson, because when you suggest that surveillance, as Carl Bildt has said, does not have a negative effect, especially when it's done in secret, this is just simply not true. We know that it has psychological impacts. We know that it has a chilling effect. And in fact, the Norwegians, after the Second World War, stopped the phone companies from writing down the telephone metadata because the Nazi occupation of Norway used that to be able to find the resistance and to kill people. So you are building a surveillance system that is total and all-encompassing to catch some terrorists, and you assert, for example, that you have oversight. But the technology that actually drives this, it does not know about judicial authority. It has no concept of a warrant or a writ. It simply has access to these fiber cables. And so when you talk about this, what I don't hear you talking about is in France, how the census data was used to eradicate the Jews, or in Holland, how 70% of the Jews were eradicated just by census data, and Sweden's myth of neutrality also was a big part of that as well. This surveillance data was used to eradicate Muslims, Christians, Jews, homosexuals, Catholics. And you say that the bigger crime is there might be a bombing. Well, you know, the interesting fact about that is that it is also a crime against all of the people you are wiretapping to spy on them. And therefore, when you spy on the whole planet, it is literally a crime against humanity. And you say that because the state does it is better, but when the state can do it and I cannot, that is a tyranny, so said Jefferson. And so what I would say to you is, you don't even know how to control your own machines. And as someone who can control your machines, you should look to the past to see what your future has in store.
I think there's a really interesting question here that we've been pushing at and tying to, which is the extent to which it's legitimate for surveillance to target people outside their domestic borders, right? And so states have historically always done that. But if you adopt a human rights framework, if you take an approach that human rights are available to all, they are universal, then there's a really interesting problem there, right? Which is that as soon as you begin to target someone on the basis of a nationality, within Europe, there are problems upon which that becomes discrimination. And I think that one of the big things that we learned, but was highlighted over the last week or so, was this frustration from the rest of the world at the US. Because the defenses that the US were putting forward were that, don't worry, we have some protections in place. But there was absolutely no consideration of the fact that there were far, far, far lower protections for anyone else in the rest of the world. And I think that this is going to be a thing that we're going to see a lot more debate on, sort of for the first time in any kind of real detail. Eleanor, I know you had one point, and then I wanted to go to the gentleman over there, and then Mike at the back.
I think we're seeing a fairly basic disagreement here, in some ways about the nature of humanity. There's this assumption on the one side that, well, democracy is this wonderful, beautiful, fragile flower, and that, well-meaning people have to do evil things under the cover of darkness to protect that flower, because people are basically evil, and that if the horrible things don't happen, then the flower will die. And if the people who are part of that flower of democracy ever even find out about the horrible things that happen to preserve it, that flower will die. I cannot reject that more utterly. I believe in a world where people are fundamentally good, and where if they are given an opportunity to rise above tyranny and given an opportunity to actually understand what's done in their name, the truth will out. And going hand in hand with that assumption that people are fundamentally evil is an assumption that some people matter more than others. That the people of my nation state, my kin, matter more than the people on the other side of a fictional line on a map. And that somehow those rights matter more than other rights. And this is why we say, protection for Americans, screw the rest of the world. Protection for Swedes, screw the rest of the world. I reject this absolutely. Humans are humans.
Well, I hope that I sometimes would hear some creative statement from any government representative once per life. It's the same exact statement every time you question them about surveillance, about monitoring web, about reducing human rights level in all countries. It's the same statement, most of all of dictatorship, but it disturbed me a lot to hear it from a representative from a country who claims to be democratic. And I quote literally what the gentleman said from France, that, ladies and gentlemen, France is not using such techniques and methods because they don't want to invest money and effort. It's a lot of money and effort. He said so. It doesn't have to do with human rights. Second, the security issue, this national security issue, which becoming slowly the most ridiculous joke ever to justify everything. I want just to tell the Mr. from Sweden and the gentleman from France that, sir, those who sacrifice freedom for security do not deserve both. So we are not going to sacrifice our freedom for what you call national security, or using this kind of passionate statement about you lost your wife, you lost your man, your sons, and they were killed just to satisfy some actions. No, we are not going to really sacrifice our freedom for just same statements all over and all over again.
That's great. If we can pass to Mike, and if I can say that we should probably be moving this now towards questions and answers rather than comments if possible. If we can hear Mike, and then I think...
I have some comments, and I will try to maybe steer them into questions, and I'll be brief, which is the most important thing. Either they're narrowing safeguards or they're not. That's just logical. If they're safeguards that are good and narrow searches, that means that you already have some evidence about the people that you are surveilling, which means you can probably arrest them or stop them already. If you are learning for the first time about plots based on that means you have broad surveillance. And if that's true, it may well be the case that they're effective in stopping terrorist activity or criminal activity, but you still have overbreadth. And so that's an important issue. It means that you don't have safeguards. It means you may be getting some benefits without having safeguards, but doesn't it mean that you don't have safeguards? See, I put that in the form of a question. The second thing I wanted to say is that historically, people who defend broad surveillance powers defend them in terms of, you don't want to lose your wife or your parents or your child. To me, these are invariably post hoc justifications for governments that have embraced and have invested in broad surveillance to begin with. And when they are forced to discuss this stuff in public, they say, well, in your particular case, you wouldn't want to lose a loved one. Well, that's certainly true. You don't want to lose a loved one, but that is not how they're thinking about it when they're putting these surveillance technologies in place. Governments have all sorts of reasons to have broad surveillance. Some of it has to do with crime, some of it has to do with national security. And I would just put it as a question to our government officials. Isn't it the case that almost all the surveillance information that you're gathering, not having anything to do with the life or death situation of a particular wife, mother, child, relative, or other individual, isn't it in fact the case that this surveillance technology is used for broader, almost always for broader national security or for broader nominally anti-crime efforts?
Perhaps that's a question that we could put to another government representative, if there's anyone else that would like to weigh in. Can someone, is there a mic? But I am keen as well to hear other government speak up on this for those that would be willing.
Thank you. Well, first of all, to the gentleman who said that I have no morality because the only reason I put forward was the fact that it would be too expensive to do mass surveillance. You've got a point. The thing is, we don't think it's good, we don't think it's particularly efficient, and we definitely think it's not moral with no checks and balances. If I said that, it's because I realize that you would never trust me. All I hear here is the fact that we are basically tools of oppression, that we have no morality except for our American guy, as you would say. Apart from that, I thought that you may be convinced by the fact that it's definitely not that what we're willing to do, definitely. About human rights and the fact that we would destroy them or ignore them, may I remind everybody that we are in democracies, and in democracy, the rule is the rule of the majority. Those laws who organize, those agencies who are dedicated to the protection of our citizens, have been voted by representatives who have been elected democratically. We have a constitution. Those laws are being checked. We have a Declaration of Rights in 1789, and I don't think we have any lesson to take on that part. Really? I mean, we're trying to do the best. We can always improve the system, and that's what we have to do. There are ways and means to control the intelligence services. We've done a lot of efforts and a lot of progress. We certainly can do better, but it's hard to find the right procedure for the very reason that if we show all the cards, then the nasty ones will take advantage of that. And that's our main problem. Again, I would love to show everything and to have clearly, publicly established procedures, but that wouldn't work. And sorry, but again, there will be no consensus in France to do basically nothing to prevent any nasty terrorist group to organize bombings in the streets of Paris. We faced terrorist waves in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. The French society, foreign-based and homegrown, and the French society is not prepared to live with that kind of anxiety. And
I think that last point
I'm
that
not
you made...
suggesting that you do nothing. I'm suggesting that you actually allow people to understand what is being done, because if you don't let people have the information to judge what's actually happening, then all of your claims to democracy are an utter lie. Democracy requires information. You cannot cast a vote if you don't know what's happening.
I think...
Intelligence agencies are rarely established as a matter of parliament, so that's total fucking bullshit.
I think that the question that is definitely coming about is around trust. I mean, that's what we're hearing here, and I think there's a frustration on the part of many people in this conversation is that it is very one-sided often. You know, there are assumptions and there's things being said in such a manner that means that doesn't allow for independent verification. I know that there are kind of a lot of technical people in this room, and one of the kind of premises of how that stuff is operated is that you have a hypothesis, you put it out there, and you publish it in such a way for other people to reach the same conclusions. And I think that that's going to be another thing that is going to be really interesting to continue to talk about, which is at what point what kind of evidence needs to be presented for civil society and others in this room to regain that trust in government. And I think that there's a disconnect there at the moment. I know the gentleman here did want to respond. I was wondering whether there was any other government representatives who would like to speak on this. I think that this is really important.
Yes, I would like to comment.
Sure.
Not on behalf of the government, because I'm not representing the government here, but I just want to say something that I'm really happy to see this kind of debate between government and civil society. I think in Tunisia we could have something like this, because today, if you, democratic country and very well developed countries. So imagine in a country like Egypt and Tunisia that we are facing now a transitional period to be a democratic country. So that this kind of debate also is very important to consider for a country like ours, because we are dealing with development. So the well-being, when we deal with, for example, the development of internet, and regarding the role that played an ITI, for example, before and today, I think we need to get this kind of balance. We need to focus on development, for sure, but at the same time, we need to have a lot of concerns on security, but, of course, the transparency issues are very important.
I think countries like Tunisia and Egypt actually have an amazing opportunity to lead, because you are in a transitional period and because you are becoming democratic, that I think that you maybe don't have to say, we're going to take the same position that's been established. You get to say, okay, well, let's actually talk through in public, do the benefits outweigh the risks? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Let's have that public conversation. That's what we're asking. And I look forward to hearing it.
If we can just have a very short point, and then I want to get 3 points from the room. There's been a number of people that have been very patient, and if we can keep them short, and then let's bring that conversation together.
Yes, I understand that this is a discussion between Utopians and non-Utopians, and I am not. I'm educated not to work for utopias, because utopias more or less always ends in catastrophe, in human catastrophes. But I would say that it is perfectly feasible to have a public debate on these matters. It's perfectly feasible to be transparent on what you are doing, until the end that the whole idea of surveillance is put into danger. But the way to do it is, of course, to have professional judges and court procedures giving the possibility or providing the possibilities to do this, and parliamentary oversights in democracies. And the difference between these systems in democracies and these systems in authoritarian or totalitarian regimes is that in authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, these systems are used to preserve power for the elite in power positions, and it is used in order to spy on their own people. This is not the case in open societies. There is, of course, so that the constitutional framework of Sweden can only be applicable to Sweden, just as the constitutional framework in Estonia can only be applicable to Estonians, and in US to US citizens. That is how the territorial states functions. This can, in a world, in cyberspace, creates problems of legitimacy. I am absolutely fully aware of that. And the issue is, how do we create the trust? And how do we create the trust enough to create legitimacy for systems that are in the interest of people and that people in democracies actually vote for? They don't vote for a state of anarchy. They don't vote for the night watcher state. They vote for a state that is taking security challenges seriously.
Thank you. So let's just get, there's a question here, the gentleman's been very patient.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis M. Faye Pape de la Fondation pour la démocratie et les droits de l'homme en Afrique. Merci aux panélistes. Moi, je voudrais juste évoquer la question du piratage politique, de l'influence politique de certains pays occidentaux, notamment la France, qui utilise souvent les faibles pays africains pour des collectes de données qu'elle utilise souvent à des fins vraiment qui portent préjudice au peuple. On parle de terrorisme ou de criminalité. Moi, je parle toujours d'espionnage sur le terrain. Nous avons vu ce qui s'est passé au Gabon, et ce qui s'est passé aussi en Tunisie, et ce qui s'est passé au Sénégal récemment. Monsieur le représentant, vous dites que vous n'utilisez pas certaines méthodes pour avoir des données concernant les citoyens. Oui, parce que vous avez un peuple qui a fait barrage. Vous avez un peuple mature, un peuple responsable. Donc vous utilisez un moyen souterrain qui vous permet d'avoir des données au niveau de certains États pour de leur faiblesse économique. Et ça, nous en avons des preuves. Et nous avons interpellé plusieurs fois des autorités françaises par rapport à ces pratiques. Et moi, je crois que aujourd'hui, l'accent doit être mis sur le paramétrage juridique quand même de cette situation-là. Et aujourd'hui, monsieur le panéliste l'a dit tout à l'heure, ils n'ont pas droit à la rétention d'informations. Si un État réclame certaines données pour l'intérêt de la sécurité nationale, on est d'accord que les gens se transmettent ces données-là. Mais quand même utiliser des données à des fins qui vous permettent d'accomplir certaines soifs politiques, c'est ça que nous déplorons. Et ça, la France use de ses moyens économiques pour faire la pression sur certains pays faiblement dotés en termes de résistance sur le plan économique. Je suis sénégalais, je vis chez vous en France, je sais bien comment ça se passe. Et nous avons des données qui nous permettent aujourd'hui de vous mettre au banc des accusés en vous disant que vous utilisez la force que vous avez vis-à-vis de certains pays pour avoir des données qui vous permettent de mettre en œuvre certaines politiques qui ne répondent pas et qui ne correspondent pas quand même aux normes réclamées par l'humanité pour une vie paisible des citoyens. C'est simplement ce point de vue que je voulais évoquer et puis avoir votre réponse par rapport à ça. Je vous remercie beaucoup.
If we can just get a few more questions, just to keep it going. There's a gentleman here who's been very patient. Then there's Richard at the back, and I saw Gillian as well. If we can just get questions from them, and then perhaps we can debate them. Yes.
Well, my question was related to the secrecy in which the surveillance is conducted. It's my opinion that, okay, fine, when individuals come to me and ask me about security, I often tell them that security through obscurity is not security at all. So if you're telling me that that's what most national security is based on, then I would be very worried about national security in these countries. And the thing is, as the leaks have proven, like with enough dedication, this information is available. So the thing is, like, do you believe that the secrecy in which the surveillance is conducted is doing more to hinder the public, which should know about this information, rather than the people it's supposed to, like the terrorists and stuff? It's not, who's it's hindering more? That's my question.
And then Richard at the back.
I want to contribute as somebody who also acts as a legislator in a governing coalition where we've just been able to stop, at least temporarily, a piece of mass surveillance legislation, the Communications Data Bill in the United Kingdom. We stopped it through political debate, but what worries me in that debate is that a lot of the dialogue, and I think we're seeing some of that here, is from activists contacting politicians to say, are you doing this because you are either A, stupid, or B, wicked, or C, both stupid and wicked? And that's a really bad basis on which to have a discussion and reach a political decision. So my question really is, how can we improve that dialogue with the people who ultimately do make the political decisions? And secondly, can we accept that sometimes we lose those decisions? Sometimes the people, in their infinite wisdom, at least in a democracy, whether an old or a new democracy, will choose the option that we don't like. And then our solution may be to try and subvert that outcome, but also it has to be, I think, to try and reach a different political decision over time when the original decision is proven to be wrong. And again, I'm not sure I see sufficient patience with that political process at the moment.
There's Gillian just there, and then there's a question just there as well. And then we can respond.
There we go. I'll make this quick. There was a comment from the front row, I can't see, sorry, but about, I think from a government, about how, you know, this is different, surveillance is different in a country like the US because we have due process and whatnot. And, you know, as an American, I realize that I do have certain rights and paths to challenge that, but non-Americans, obviously, as I think you all know, do not have the same means that I do as challenging surveillance in the US, surveillance of them by the US rather. And as we've seen, the US government is perfectly willing to circumvent its own laws, otherwise, you know, Guantanamo, for example. And so with that in mind, I would like to hear from the non-Americans on the panel as to what you think civil society from outside of the US can do. What options do you have for challenging these programs coming from outside of your countries?
Perhaps if actually we can answer them, then we'll go to your question afterwards. Would Amma and Moez like to respond to that?
Not to this comment, but...
شكرا جزيلا. جبريل جلو الصحفي من موريتانيا. إذا كان موضوع حماية المعلومات عبر الإنترنت في الدول الديمقراطية يثير لغطا كبيرا بين النشطاء وممثلي الحكومات، فإن الدول الدكتاتورية تعاني وضعا مختلفا. هناك عدة دول إفريقية يسيطر رجال أعمال معروفين بأعينهم على المراقبة عبر الإنترنت. نحن لدينا موضوع حديث في موريتانيا. هناك رجل أعمال مشهور جدا كان يسيطر على الرقابة على الإنترنت، ولما اختلف مع السلطة كشف معلومات تتعلق بالسلطة مباشرة. يعني أن الرقابة لا تحمي فقط من في السلطة وتعرضهم أيضا للخطر. بعض البلدان أيضا التي لا تتمتع بالإمكانيات اللازمة لمراقبة المعلومات حول الإنترنت تلجأ إلى طرق خبيثة جدا. في موريتانيا مثلا هنالك أسبوعيا سرقة أجهزة كمبيوترات صحفيين متنقلة أو من مكاتبهم من طرف أعوان الأمن. شكرا.
If I may respond actually to what perhaps Gillian has raised. From the discussion we're seeing here, I think it's becoming more and more evident that the utopian are actually the intelligence and national security agencies and not what we're having, what's coming from the panel. And I think that the utopian national security is the primary enemy for national security. And I think at this stage we should focus less actually on a discussion with government representatives and actually sometimes corporate representatives and focus before that on building the freedom that you can with which sit with them at the table and enter a negotiating position, because this is actually futile even in a democratic setting like what you have in the global north. I don't see this leading anyway, especially if you are going through a transition, and especially if you are trying to build a more democratic form of government, and democratic here can have more than one interpretation. So I'd really want to encourage civil society participants in this forum not to make any demands or not to convey any messages to the coalition, and rather let's talk to ourselves first. Let's create and actually put more effort into using the tools that we are developing to strengthen our own privacy, anonymity, and increasingly autonomy. And then we will be able to enter a negotiating position and with the state, with intelligence. And I don't see the route that countries going through transition, like Egypt, like Tunisia, and hopefully many more, should be the route that we are seeing falling apart in front of our eyes right now.
Yeah, I actually think there's another thing that we can do. It sort of seems from these discussions sometimes that we're like opposite of government officials and some other people that maybe have different viewpoints, but actually is often also about a lot of misunderstanding. We have a very good understanding of often technical knowledge to sort of understand what surveillance actually does and how it is very dangerous. For many people, that is not as straightforward. So I think we have, as civil society, also a very important role to talk to people in an open way and to sort of discuss in more depth what is actually happening and how this threatens us. And so I'd rather not use the word educate because it sounds a little bit sort of negative. But it is an important debate. And for example, we as Bits of Freedom had a couple of weeks ago a workshop in Parliament where lots of parliamentarians actually attended, and we talked about cybersecurity, we talked about these issues and why they are important and what are the risks. So I think that is another very important thing that we can do. And I see parliamentarians and a lot of other people working for the government becoming more open about sort of entering into this discussion.
I would like to comment on how important is this kind of debate again, because today I'm really willing to see the government of Tunisia and the civil society and of course Tunisian Internet Agency team are really willing to have this kind of debate. It's important to raise the awareness of people, to explain what is important to mention today, for what is important to do for the well-being of Tunisian in this transitional period. I think that there are two kinds of barriers. The barriers are historical, mainly historical, because, for example, when I worked for the government for a long period of time, and after the revolution, when I got this position at TI, it was for us very important to open the dialogue, to open the door to the society, to work, to talk to them. Of course, they don't trust us because of our history, because of what we have done for a long period of time. But I think this is kind of debate that could be very, very important today. But this is one of the constraints. The second kind of constraints is that in the society themselves, they need to be much more accepting the dialogue. They need to also to walk through the governments. I think that they are showing always a lot of messages, very strong messages, of course. Maybe they're right because they're their principles. We respect their principles, but at the same time, they need to accept that something needs to change, needs time to change. It's not easy. When you work for the government, you have responsibility. You have a lot of things to do. You have a lot of concerns on security, on democratic issues, on bilateral international cooperation, a lot of challenges at the same time. But I think there is a goodwill. We need goodwill from both sides to talk to each other and to raise awareness, and then we can reach open dialogue. And we can reach a lot of, very important results with this kind of subject. It's a very complicated topic, really. I'm willing to have a comment from my government here, but it's really important to have this kind of debate and to show them and to let them trust somehow the way we are doing.
I guess to a certain degree, I do agree with Amr that in a lot of ways, this is a time to sit back and focus on tools and focus on our capabilities as civil society, because it isn't actually the case that we simply do have to accept surveillance from the state. We do actually have agency there, just in terms of the systems that we choose to use and the systems that can be surveilled. But I also think that it is important to, especially, take advantage of this moment where many things that we sort of knew beforehand have suddenly become visible, and to make statements and to say, no, this is the shape of the world that we want to live in, and that we reject the utopian ideal of perfect security, and we want to live in a state of balanced freedom where we do accept risks. And, to realize that this takes time, but that the goal needs to be clear.
I can mention something that maybe it's very important that we have done. For example, on Saturday, when we opened the door of ITI and we worked on the previous equipment, censorship equipments, that was something that's very, very interesting for the community, because they now knows how things have done before. And this could be really, really encourage maybe government people to work, on government officials in the future, to work with the society and to open the door to any details about this. But at the same time, you need to accept that there is also some concerns on security that we need to deal from the government perspectives. But in a good way, I'm sure there's always something that you can not agree on it and you can trust, that's for sure, but at the same time we need to move forward. And if you want to do this kind of things, that would be very important for us.
I don't know if I agree entirely, but I do look forward to the process of opening continuing.
So if we just take 3 last questions and then begin to wrap up. So we had Jake, the gentleman there, and also Fikr.
So,
if we can keep them short, please.
Totally. I wanted to say that I think the gentleman from the UK Parliament who said that we should be more civil in these debates, I agree with him. I think it's important to say that there are these appeals to emotion and appeals to authority in the argument that we hear from the state. And as someone who has had a murdered family member and has suffered child abuse, you don't speak for me, first of all. And second of all, when you talk about the rule of law and Telescenario sells equipment to dictatorships and you let those CEOs go free, it tarnishes Sweden. And when the French do this with AMSIS, and I'm sitting with my friends from Morocco here, who are being targeted by the AMSIS system, what I want to know is, will the two of you put your money where your mouth is and your state's actions where your ideals allegedly are, and will you stop putting down the people of Morocco by supporting an absolute monarchy? Will you stop Telescenario from exporting so-called lawful interception to dictatorships in the stands? What I want to know is, can we agree that appeals to emotion, this is to the panel, that appeals to emotion and appeals to authority, especially in the form of secrecy, are not acceptable, and that we should stop exporting a neo-colonialist attitude about surveillance and that equipment? Is that a reasonable thing to go towards as a higher dialogue?
I think if we just get the question here as well, and then we can begin to wrap up.
I'm from the Tunisian civil society. Just an example, you know, the shoe cost, because about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, someone said maybe he had a bomb in his shoes. Every day, millions of people are obliged to take their shoes, and that's a loss of billions of minutes for the people. And the result is nothing. I don't think that they even found. So the question is, how, if we want to have confidence with agencies, you are not obliged to disclose all your cards, but you are, maybe if you disclose methods and how effective they are, so people are aware of maybe some ineffective method in surveillance who, by their cost, is huge, and also the impact on the well-being of the people. And if we start from that, there will be confidence if we exchange method, effective or non-effective method for doing surveillance.
If we can pass the microphone down to Fikr.
Well, my question is actually also for the government officials, but maybe Moez can also say something about it. I think the reason why everybody's so passionate about it is because it actually touches upon all our democratic beliefs. And there's a notion that we feel secret police and in mass surveillance, they have to be transparent about it, and maybe they're not to the people. But the people also have no understanding on how the transparency and the checks and balances behind it go within the government. So these gentlemen are, it's their job, defending the system, but do they actually know what the secret police is doing? And do we know when they go rogue? I mean, when do we sort of see things within the government, also the checks and balances? And I think that's also very unclear for all the citizens around the world.
I think they're the kind of 3 core points that have come up throughout this, right? Which is around trust, and then asks of government in a way that we can reasonably begin to have a dialogue on. And so I was wondering if we could collectively kind of answer some of those questions, and then within that incorporate the one ask to the Freedom Online Coalition. If there was a very narrow thing, if there was one bit, what is that thing that we could ask them to do to help address some of these concerns?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. I think this kind of conference and this kind of coalition, and also there is a conference in Sweden, for example, I participated in Stockholm. It was really important. And also the IGF, don't forget that. It's very important to participate actively, because it's good to participate, but at the same time, it's very important also to raise your voice. It's very important that the community, for example, any person from the community today has the opportunity to express his voice, express his ideas, and to deal with these issues. And at the same time, we need to educate them, because while participating in this kind of debate, there is a lot of education. A lot of people from Tunisia heard the word, for example, surveillance, or maybe different times because of the regime, but today they're hearing from democratic countries, government officials, and from you participating in this panel, how it is important to participate to this kind of dialogue. And I think this is something that I really believe, and I really encourage the government to open more the doors to this kind of debate.
What I'm taking from this discussion, and actually which is the reason that I'm here, is that I think that when our governments go promoting human rights outside of their own countries, even more they have a responsibility to make sure that human rights in their own countries are abided by. And I think the discussion here today proves that there is much to do in their own countries, and I'm very happy that the gentleman from Sweden and France contributed to the discussion by showing that we have lots to discuss. So please do not only point the fingers outwards your own country, but also look very critically to your own government.
I think that establishing trust over the long term requires openness. You know, especially when we have seen, and I will speak of nothing else, just for the U.S., you know, we've seen that there was a massive overstep, that there were things that are, you know, very plainly illegal on the face of the law. We've seen secret courts and secret laws and secret interpretations of laws and secret enabling legislation. You know, given the magnitude of the overreach that we've seen, and we've seen similar overreaches in other countries, the only way to establish trust is going to be through openness, through full public review, through another church commission that looks at everything. The last time we had a church commission, it was revealed that the NSA was doing a lot of things that had absolutely no merit. You know, the entire telegraph surveillance program that went on for 30 years produced no actionable intelligence. So it was, you know, and was, you know, completely illegitimate. So it was stopped by the church review. This needs to happen again because apparently, you know, the message didn't come through last time that the oversights are not to be undermined. And I think that it is essential, especially if any nation state wants to have any legitimacy in claiming to promote democracy and human rights overseas, if a nation state believes that they should, you know, if a nation state has signed on to the EU Declaration of Human Rights, if a nation state has signed on to the, you know, the UN Fundamental Declaration of Human Rights, then it is irresponsible and illegitimate of that nation to say that just because people are outside their borders, they don't get those rights, that they very publicly and with you know, great you know, pomp and great merit said belong to everyone. You can't say both all human beings have certain basic rights and only people in our country are free from unlimited spying, unlimited exploitation. You have to pick one or the other. Either remove your signature from all of the UN and EU basic rights documents, or start treating people like people.
On the same week that the leaks, the recent leaks have happened, a group of civil society organizations, including Article 19, Amnesty International, and the organization I come from, have released a set of principles balancing freedom of information requirements and national security, quote unquote, and I think they make a very good starting point for a discussion defining exactly what is national security, defining exactly what are the what can be expected of a national security agency in terms of how it operates. And I think that for the civil society organizations that are interested in engaging with government at this stage, on this level, they'd make an excellent starting point. I encourage them all to look at them. For governments, there is a lot of work to be done to prove the worth of actually having a conversation, particularly this week and the year we're seeing ahead with the increasing leaks. I'd really like to stress for civil society organizations that we need to do less policy work in some situations, at least in some contexts, and do more implementation of the solutions that we have. They are the only thing that we can actually trust to build our own privacy, anonymity, and connectivity.
Thank you. And so with that, all that remains to be done is to thank our panelists and thank the government representatives and Moez for this fantastic conference. So thank you.